should tell you about my suit first. Maybe you care about that. Maybe you don't. The first thing you need to know is these are tiny Elon Musk heads. And this is a Twitter suit. In the lining here, there's a bunch of comments from Twitter about another suit this company made for me.
It's God. God is that which calls you to make the appropriate sacrifices and calls you on it when you don't. And try to escape that and see what happens. We know perfectly well, that that's a pathway to hell. And you might say, I don't believe in hell. And I would say, that means you don't know anything.
The first thing you need to know is
this is a Twitter suit. In the lining here, there's a bunch of comments from Twitter about another suit. These are tiny Elon Musk heads.
Jake, I can't really see. Is that your Twitter suit?
Yeah. These are my tweets. I think the tiny Elon Musk heads might be my personal version of hell. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I would imagine that actually in hell there are literally tiny Elon Musk heads like just floating all over the air.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I'm joined by our trusty super producer, Jake Appett. Our graphic designer, J. Andrew World, has some family stuff. He's not going to be here this second, but he might be joining us in the post game. Certainly, Matt McManus, political science professor, frequent guest on the show, frequent co-author of mine, definitely one of my top 10 Canadians, is for sure going to be joining us on the post game, where we are going to be talking to Curtis Yarvin. Matt, talking about Curtis Yarvin, not talking to Curtis Yarvin. I've done that. Wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I have done it. But in any case, Matt is enough of a masochist that he has read a tremendous amount of Curtis Yarvin for something he's writing for Commonweal, so he's going to share that with us in the post game. We're also going to look at Ben Shapiro's new formula for assessing political legitimacy. Actually, do we have that graphic right now? Ben Shapiro's formula. I just want to give the people a taste of what they'll be getting in the post game. This is something that apparently he's been hard at work at in the Daily Wire laboratories, coming up with this formula for assessing whether or not governments are legitimate. I don't want to spoil it, but you can hear all about that in the post game with Matt. But before we get to the post game for Give Them an Argument patrons, if you're not a patron, by the way, that's patreon.com/Ben Burgis. There's no time like the present. But before we get to that, in the main show, we have a pretty action-packed program for the next little while. So we are going to be talking to Professors Adnan Husain and Harvey J. Kaye, who are both returning champs, both historians, and we're going to be talking about the Marxist theory of history. After that, going to be playing some clips from a debate that I hosted on my Callin show between Glenn Greenwald and Branko Marcetic about what Glenn calls the Bernie AOC left and his critique of that, and why Branko doesn't buy that. And then we are going to be talking about some interesting stuff that's been happening on social media in the last few days, involving Jimmy Dore and why he thinks I'm a liar and a fraud and an egghead that was in there, an egghead, and many other bad things besides, and why I have extended the invitation for him to come explain all these things to me on here. So we can have a nice, calm, in the weeds discussion about whether what he's saying makes sense and why he's opted for no. Nope, not going to do that. So in any case, all that is coming up later in the show. But what you just saw, of course, was friend of the show, Jordan Peterson. And I have a question for Jake. So take all the time you want with this. It's not a complicated question, but is Jordan Peterson okay?
it seems like he's had different amounts of okayness over the years. But I think that the people were remarking that it seems like he's going into his evangelical era, and he always had that sort of traveling street preacher energy. You know what I mean? So this is not really a surprise, but it just seems like there's a gravity toward insane evangelicalism that these right-wing guys have. Like I remember we were talking about the fall of Yiannopoulos, where he was hawking little Christian figurines, right, on like daytime TV. So compared to that, he's maybe okay, but emotionally, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I think that he's definitely okay in a sense that Milo is not. He's not on the Catholic Fundamentalist Home Shopping Network, hawking the figurines. This is a lovely Virgin Mary, although it would be very funny to see Jordan Peterson do that. But yeah, emotionally, I do wonder. I will tastefully leave it there. But we do want to move on to another one of our good friends here, who is Timothy Poole, who because we were talking about Timothy last time on the show, and some of Timothy's thoughts about socialism and Marxism, and since that segment, he's had some more. So let's take a look. Here's what Tim Poole tweeted about commies, or maybe just commies who go to college. I'm not sure. You be the judge. But he says, college commies be all like, which, I just want to pause and just appreciate that framing device. College commies be like, but in any case, we talked about that last time. He set up one of the other ones the same way, like this kind of like 1990s brick wall comedian thing. That's white people be like, that's. But college commies be all like, I am forced to work a wage slave job, otherwise I will be homeless. And I'm just wondering what they think being alive is supposed to be like. Like, bro, go start a farm commune, then tell me how many hours you have to work every day. So there's a lot to break down here, but what are your initial thoughts?
I mean, I think it would be interesting to maybe talk to Tim about like what stage of capitalist development that we're in, right? Whether maybe I see what he's saying, that like in the ancient times, like maybe, I don't think most Marxists think that like at the dawn of human civilization, life was a cakewalk, right? And that's the alternative. But I think most Marxists, and correct me if I'm wrong, would say that there are, because of, just where we're at generally, there are options other than working 16 hours a day on in a commune on a farm, or, working 8 to 12 hours a day, or however much you have to work for a capitalist in a factory or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so we're going to be talking later tonight with Harvey and Adnan about the Marxist theory of history, but sort of right at the core of that theory of history is the idea that the level of development of what Marx calls the forces of production, the capacity of a society to make stuff, when Marx says, these are exchanges with nature to meet human needs, that, you take, what you have in nature, the plants and animals and, the wind and the air and all that stuff, and find ways to get products out of that that have use value for humans. That the development of that over time is upstream of the kinds of economic arrangements, what Marx call the relations of production that you have at any given time, whether you have lords and serfs, workers and capitalists, whatever it is that you have. And that you need to have, feudalism before you can have capitalism. You need to have capitalism before you have socialism. And the whole idea is that by the time, you get up to the point of a really advanced capitalist society, it's developed the forces of production so much that you can have socialism without everybody just, like going back to the land and, and like just starting their own little farm commune. The whole idea of Marxism as opposed to previous kinds of socialist thought is precisely no. I mean, that's not how it's going to work, right? What we need to do is take over this incredibly advanced industrial machine that's been created by capitalism, and then we can, and then because we live in high tech modernity, we have the capacity to have a more egalitarian society that's not just all of us, working on the farm commune for 16 hours a day and sharing what few crumbs, that we have there.
Yeah. Who would you say is like the main commune socialist pre-Marx? I feel like there's like an American socialist on the tip of my tongue or there's a couple of socialists like pre-Marx, right, who are all about communes.
Yeah, like Owen or
Owen. Yeah, exactly. It seems like his his objections are maybe like I don't know now. Well, I'm gonna have to do some math, but like 250 years, more than 200 years late, right? He's responding to like a pre-Marx socialist who just thinks that we should all create communes, which could be better than the current system that we have. But I think the Marxist alternative.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, but yeah, Marx certainly understood you're not going to ask people to go back to that and get much buy-in, that you like to. I mean, obviously not Marx. This would be anachronistic, but I mean, like the sort of basic Marxist insight is like, yeah, I mean, it's not like we're asking people to exchange a society of, I don't know, Netflix and and like microwavable food and all that stuff for one where you just live on the land and work all day every day. It's that we think that we can have high-tech modernity in a more democratic and egalitarian way that would be better, and that would actually be going forward, and that would make life better for most people, which really brings me to the second part of the tweet. So if we look at that again, he says here, so all right, so you're forced to work away, college communists be all like, I'm forced to work a wage slave job, otherwise I'd be homeless. I'm just wondering what they think being alive is supposed to be like. And this is such an amazing false dichotomy that like the only possible way that you could be alive is to have a wage slave job. I mean, I assume that like trying my hardest to like interpret this charitably, which is not easy, but I mean, like trying, it seems like what, he has in mind is somebody who thinks, well, they should just be able to have consumption without having to work at all. That like, it should just, that nobody should have to work in any way, that, that you just sort of have things magically appear before you, or other people could work, but you could just, sit at home all day, every day, which by the way, right now is what we've got for some people. If you live off stock ownership or you have inherited wealth or, whatever, like those people literally do have that. But you can have, you could say, look, I mean, maybe in some Star Trek future where we have replicators and stuff, then you really can completely delink, work from consumption. But, short of that kind of fully automated luxury communism utopia, here's something that life could be like. You could just have it be the case that we have democracy in the economy the way that we do in politics, in a much more meaningful way than we currently do in politics. That instead of having to, he says a wage slave job, part of what that means is that, even though obviously it's tremendous historical progress that under capitalism, rich people could only rent poor people, they can't buy them. It's still the case that there's this sort of structure of hierarchy and domination with no democratic accountability. That if you work for Amazon, you don't get to decide, okay, how much should we keep, and and do we think that the Jeff Bezos spaceship fund should take up a big chunk of what we produce, or not? How you work, what you produce, how you divide up the product. All of these things are outside of people's control. And in fact, if he's throwing this off as a rhetorical question, what do you think life could be like? It's like, well, if we didn't have capitalism, then what is life even? Like what's the, like how could it possibly be any other way? And it seems to me that if you actually wanted to know that, the first step might be to do a little bit of research about whether socialists have have said anything about that or not. Which, spoiler, yeah, they have. Karl Marx, certainly, he wrote this classic pamphlet, The Critique of the Gotha Program, where he says, well, some version of some of what I just said, that, well, in a really advanced, the word he'd use was communism, for this kind of future society he's imagining, back before it was, that term was associated with the Soviet Union and all of that. But, in a really advanced communist society where you don't have, where, there's been so much technological progress that you have superabundance, there's plenty to go around, and, people's cultural attitudes towards work has shifted. Maybe you can completely delink consumption from work, that people could just kind of give what they can and take what they need. But in a earlier phase of communist society, you would still have to have some connection between those two things, that you're being rewarded with consumption in some way proportional to what you're putting in. But workers would be collectively deciding how that worked. It wouldn't just be decided for them by people who happened to have the class position that they were in charge of these resources. Or that's a short pamphlet. If Tim really wanted to, I think he actually does live on some, I don't think it's a farm commune, but he lives in some kind of interesting compound. Andy was actually going to tell us about this next time he's on the show. He might, but in any case, if Tim, has a room there with a nice comfy chair, and he really wants to do some reading, he could check out David Schweikart. Wrote a book called After Capitalism, which is a really detailed examination of the sort of logistics of how a kind of real short-term, realistic, imaginable socialist society would work, with like worker co-ops, getting seed money from nationalized banks, and what a lot of the logistics of that would be. And look, agree, disagree, but I mean, just sort of presenting this like, bro, what do you think life? You know what, capitalism? I mean, what would life be even like if we didn't have capitalism?
Yeah, and isn't it what Fisher's capitalist realist idea that
Totally.
Poole is like playing out like a oath right now, but just basically saying like an alternative to capitalism. No one, that surely can't be imagined, right? Like, just such a showing to what extent it just become this like hegemonic idea. I feel like for someone who, to some extent, fashions himself like a free thinker, or against the, raging against the machine, at least the way he started, at least I've learned from some, you and guests on this show, that he was like at Occupy Wall Street, and saw himself as some kind of iconoclast, that he literally cannot imagine any alternative to the system that we're currently in, propped up, by the elites we currently have, that literally live the way that he is critiquing in his tweet, which is that they just sit back and don't do any work while other people do work, and they, like you said, they collect profit off of that. So I don't know. I saw someone say, hey, Poole's just trolling with these tweets, but if he's trolling, to what end,
Yeah, exactly. And he's certainly, I mean, look, as always with guys like this, whether he entirely believes what he's saying or not is maybe the least interesting question to me, because he has an audience, he has a big audience, and I want to know what they think is true based on the version of the world that he's giving them, and to do whatever we can, with our modest platform to push back against that. Okay. So thinking a little bit more about sort of general principles, we've been talking about, okay, how a socialist society could actually work, why, Tim is wrong to think that this is the only possible way that life could be, that, you have to have, bosses and stock ownership and, and all that stuff, that's all just etched into the fabric of reality. But thinking a little bit more about general principles that are sort of underlying that, I wanted to talk about something else I've written lately, do this for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll bring on Harvey and Adnan. So thinking about, okay, so we could have something other than capitalism, but why would we want that? What do we find so objectionable about the way that resources and economic power are distributed right now? One good starting point for that, from my perspective, is to talk about Rawls. John Rawls wrote a book called A Theory of Justice, which really revolutionized kind of late 20th century political philosophy. And so this is something that I've often brought up when talking to right wingers. So that for example, here's from the debate that I did a year and change ago with Charles Kirk.
But I want to zero in on this because I think we have a really interesting point philosophically. Yeah. Do you think if someone takes a risk in America, they should be able to keep the reward?
Not entirely, no. I mean, you don't think entirely. I mean, like, the only way you could think entirely is if you were an anarchist and you didn't think that we should.
But what are the limitations on that then?
I mean, again, I think that the question that you want to ask, if the question is some transfer of wealth justified? Because I think that's the real question, right? When are transfers of wealth justified? And I think that you need to go back to what are the principles that justify what you think a distribution of wealth in the first place should be. Now, you could think that whatever kind of distribution you get, letting the chips fall where they may in a free market, that's what's justified. I don't think that. I think that the distribution of wealth that we have, and I think taxation and redistribution, even in the sort of market socialist system that I was advocating earlier, I think you'd still need those things. But I think that the distribution of wealth that's justified is the one that would emerge from a social contract that people would agree to under certain circumstances.
So, I guess it all comes down to numbers, I guess.
Well, no, I mean that's so. This isn't a claim about numbers. This is a claim about basic moral principles.
But
I think that the question is, if you were, the best version of something like contract theory, if you were behind John Rawls's veil of ignorance,
which I totally reject.
Sure, I mean, of course you totally reject it, Charlie.
I'm happy to get into the Rawlsian theory of justice.
You couldn't believe any of the things that you believed if you didn't reject it. But I think that.
But I actually, I'm going to ask you about the veil of ignorance in a second.
If you're asking about what I think, I don't think that there's some magic number that like, oh, you can tax up to this, you can't tax up to that. I think that if you want to know whether a tax system is just, and generally a system of how property works is just, you should ask, if you knew that you had to live in the society, but you didn't know who you're going to be in the society, would you agree to it? And the same way that if you didn't know whether you were going to be black or white, you wouldn't agree to racial discrimination being part of the rules of your society. If you didn't know whether you're going to be born into a poor family or a rich one, if you didn't know whether you'd have the particular skills that help you climb up the educational or career ladders of the professional managerial class, if you didn't know any of those things, how would you want the rules of society to work?
I have an answer.
And I think that's going to be the answer that's going to tell you when redistribution of wealth is justified.
I would want the rules of society to value action over favoritism, hard work over complacency, family creation over licentiousness, right? Liberty and the pursuit of virtue. Those things are right and wrong regardless of what veil of ignorance, if I would be born in a lower class or a higher class. Those things are objectively good. So to use Rawls' own thought experiment.
So you talked about hard work there.
Yes.
So if you have a basic value to industriousness, if you have a basic objection to people getting things that you don't work for, here are two things that you should be against.
Okay.
Inheritance and stock ownership.
So in that clip, I'm talking about Rawls's theory of justice. Charlie, I think it's safe to say, doesn't quite understand what the idea is, because he said, well, I don't care what situation I'm in. Here are the things I value. It's like, yeah, but that's not the question. The question is, are we treating people unfairly? The test of whether we're treating people unfairly is if they were just trying to advance their own interests and they didn't know who they were going to be in this situation, would they sign off on it? But that last point about stock ownership and inherited wealth, which there's a lot of interesting stuff that went on after that in the debate. But that last point, really brings us to a different philosopher, G.A. Cohen, who, we've talked about in this show before, but his point about equality of opportunity, that ultimately anytime you have a conception of equality of opportunity, we're talking about this a little bit with R.M. Brown, I think in the post game last week, that any conception of equality of opportunity is a conception of which obstacles to some people getting better outcomes are unreasonable and you should try to get rid of them. So, what Cohen, so he wrote this book called Why Not Socialism, a very, very short book, really strongly recommended. I talked about that book with RJ Esco on an old episode, like, I don't know, a year or more ago. Time all blurs together. But in that book, he says, well, look, you can have bourgeois equality of opportunity where you basically say the obstacles we want to get rid of are like legal ones, like regimes that say if you're born a serf, you're not going to be allowed to become a lord, or if you're if you're black, you're not allowed to do certain things because we might have racial apartheid laws, or etc. So bourgeois equality of opportunity is about getting rid of that stuff, which is hugely important. But it only goes so far. There's a kind of intermediary kind that he talks about. But just to sort of skip ahead to Cohen's own idea about this, he says ultimately what we should want is socialist equality of opportunity. And what he means by socialist equality of opportunity is basically what I said a few months after the Kirk clip, when I was on the Joe Rogan show at the beginning. Joe asks essentially why I'm a socialist, what I mean by that, and this that we're about to watch is part of the answer. I mean, short term, I care very much about, having, socialized healthcare, about having, like tuition-free higher education so people can go to school without having to be in debt for like decades, which is obscene. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on both those things.
And I do think that like the level of inequality that we get from our current system is indefensible. That, in other words, that if one person has more than another just because they like chose to work harder, then like that's one thing, right? I can,
right.
That, I would, person A wants to stay home and watch Netflix, and, person B, wants to work for more hours than like, person B should get more money. I am totally fine with that. But what bothers me is when you have these massive inequalities that have huge effects in people's lives that are linked to things that aren't under their control. And I think we have a lot of that too.
I would agree with you 100%.
Yeah. So what I'm laying out there is essentially what G.A. Cohen, I don't name check him in that part of the conversation, should have get some Rogan viewers to read Why Not Socialism, but it's essentially what G.A. Cohen means by socialist equality of opportunity, which is that essentially that a social system, a distribution of wealth is unjust to the extent that, or distribution of economic power is unjust to the extent that you have inequalities that are linked to factors beyond the control of the people with the short end of the stick. And anybody who knows a little bit about this stuff, might think, well, okay, so in the first clip, you're agreeing with Rawls, second clip, you're agreeing with Cohen. But if you know a little bit more about both of these guys, they did have some real disagreements. So people know, I talked about this last week. I recently started a philosophy Substack. It's called Philosophy for the People, because for a long time now, I've wanted to make philosophy writing a bigger part of my output. Still going to, keep writing for Jacobin and the Daily Beast and everything about, day-to-day politics, but I wanted to do more of this kind of philosophical, theoretical kind of writing. So I started that. That's benburgess.substack.com. People can go check that out. The first essay, it's going to be every Sunday. The first essay, which went up the first Sunday, was called Hume Hell, which was about David Hume. It was a deep dive on David Hume's essays on suicide and the afterlife and the arguments he makes there, with a little bit of reflection on the link between how to think about the history of philosophy and what I'm about to talk to Harvey and Adnan about, which is the Marxist theory of history. And then the one that came out yesterday is called Thinking Harder About Justice, Rawls versus Cohen versus Marx. You can see J. Andrew World's beautiful artwork on both of those. And in there, try to think about, okay, Rawls's difference principle, which is what he gets out of that veil of ignorance thought experiment I just talked about, and G.A. Cohen's socialist equality of opportunity principle, and if there's a conflict between them, is there really a conflict, or are these just sort of slightly different ways of talking or thinking about justice that, you know, that might ultimately mask some deeper agreements, how those fit in with what Karl Marx says about some of this stuff in the Critique of the Gotha program, which we talked about earlier. So people who want to know what I think about all that stuff can check out the Substack essay. And I'll say, just as a teaser for next week, the next one is going to be about probably the third most famous Slovenian in the world. If the first, if the most famous one is Melania Trump, and the second most famous one is Luka, then we've got Slavoj at number 3, because there's been a lot of discourse about him lately. Wanted to weigh in on a little bit, not a little bit. Thought this would be a good venue to do that. So again, do go check that out. Do subscribe to that. So you can read all of this stuff. You can also watch me talk about this stuff. I've been talking about each of these essays on Sunday afternoons on This Is Revolution, and cross-streamed onto this channel with Stefan Bertram Lee. So that's been so the essays have been dropping at like 11 a.m. Eastern on Sundays, and the conversations with Stefan about them have been at 4 Eastern on Sundays. So please do check all that stuff out. Last thing, my co-host for this event would be very mad at me if I went this whole time and I didn't mention it. So last thing before we bring on Harvey and Adnan is that we are going to be doing a live show in New York City, the Big Apple, on Sunday after next. So that is Sunday, January 22nd. That is a Give Them an Argument / This Is Revolution / Left Reckoning live show featuring some people who I like a lot, who have all been multiple time guests on this show. That's Bhaskar Sunkara, who's the founding editor of Jacobin magazine, Sam Seder from the Majority Report, Emma Vigeland from, I guess, also the Majority Report, but mostly the Emma Sports Vigeland Network, just her sports show. But I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's going to be really good. We're probably going to get one of the comedians in our world to open for us. We're still figuring that out. But after that, once we get a chance to talk to all those people I just mentioned, I think it should be a lot of fun. The one in LA that we did was fantastic, and I think in a lot of ways this is going to be even better. Also, in LA, you didn't get to see Jake Appett, and I know that was a source of sadness for a lot of people. So you will get to see Jake in New York. We've got a link to get tickets for that in down there below the box where you see our heads right now where we're talking. So please do that. Really looking forward to that show next week. The guests on air next week are going to, there's going to be Jason Miles and also Sam Seder is going to be on next week. So get a little taste of it as we build up to the actual live show. So really, really looking forward to that. But with no further ado, it is time for tonight's main event, which is going to be Professor Adnan Husain, back for the first time in a couple months, and Professor Harvey J. Kaye.
Good evening.
How you doing?
Okay, not too bad. I mean, I know it won't matter to you guys, but the Packers lost last night, ended their playoff possibilities, and had to recover from that. I mean, it was a terrible season, but it's still a matter of getting over the fact that the season's over, done.
Yeah. Fair. So I should, I mean, look, it doesn't matter to me from that perspective, but
Oh, looks like we lost Ben. There he is.
Yeah, so I'm actually gonna be back in like 30 seconds. You guys amuse yourselves.
Okay.
Adnan, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing all right. It's great to see you, Harvey. How have you been besides, of course, the Packer trauma?
Well, actually, it was a very strange sort of. Lorna and I today we went out for a walk and we said, by the way, are people watching us as we have this
They
conversation?
might be. They might be.
I'll just say
Making
that
a good story.
there were really no holidays for us in this sense. We went to New York before, like a week before the Christmas period, to see our daughter and son-in-law, and within 24 hours after we got there, my daughter tested positive for COVID.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So we left with the idea that if we did get sick, let's at least be home when it hits us. So we came home and then we were just indoors through the cold of Wisconsin for like all that stretch. I mean, we got out to walk and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
we both agreed that we had no holiday really, no in the sense of capital H holiday.
Right.
Yeah.
Ben, you're muted. Oh, there you
Yeah, might as well throw that in there too while the rest of that stuff was going on. Well, I do not care about the Packers from a fan perspective, but I do, it does, look, I think that there's a sort of objective case. I don't, but there's an objective case that socialists should all root for the Packers because they're the only one that isn't owned by a wealthy parasite.
Right.
Yeah. Working America's team.
A good way of putting it.
Yeah.
The Dallas Cowboys used to claim to be America's team. So for a while, Packer T-shirts said something like the people's team. Was that kind of thing.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. So I had, so you were on before, late last year, to talk about your book, this book, the British Marxist Historians, which was just recently reissued by Zero Books. People should go check that out. I know you've also had a conversation with Adnan about that on his podcast. And I've also talked a little bit about related subjects to with Adnan on the show. That we talked about an essay that G.A. Cohen had written about Marxism and historical inevitability, and I thought it would just be really interesting to get you guys together to talk a little bit about about stuff like this. So, one way just to sort of generally start it off is like, before even getting to like what you think holds up about this and what doesn't, and and how we should think about it now. Okay, the British Marxist historians, when you call a historian a Marxist, right? Like that means that they're looking at history through a certain lens. So let's just start at that really basic level. What is that lens?
Well, should I start?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Look, that question is interesting to me in the sense that over the course of the many years I've been an academic, an intellectual, a leftist, a Marxist, whatever. It's always been interesting how many people would answer that question by saying, well, Marxists are just interested in class and leave it at that. Okay. Or the others who say, in other words, you think that all of history is determined by economics, right? It's that kind of thing. And one of the things that really moved me about the British Marxist historians' work was that they were asking us, regardless of the period of British history that they were dealing with, or for that matter, whatever place in the world Hobsbawm got himself into to work, they were asking us to consider, and I'll put this in terms a philosopher might appreciate, they were really asking us to consider the kind of the morality and justice question. That is, a good way of looking at it is this question of exploitation. To me, that's a pivotal term in all of this, exploitation. And as I was sitting here earlier, I recalled something that my wife, I used to do this on, can I do this? Intro to Sociology exam.
Yeah.
Okay. I taught a lot of historical stuff, some political stuff, but I also was for all of like 30 plus years, the instructor of the big Intro to Sociology class. But one of the things about my university was that it really was not built around disciplines. It was built around these sort of problem areas that we all worked on. And yet they still had these discipline introductory courses. So in sociology, I thought that I could just do what I wanted, basically. In fact, the joke was it was Harvey 101 in some ways. And I wanted students I wanted students to come at this idea of sociology, not unlike C. Wright Mills did. Okay. And C. Wright Mills was one of those people who wrote a book called The Plain Marxists. I think that was the title of the book, or at least the Marxists, and it was about plain Marxists. And he actually saw himself in that tradition, even though he really wasn't. Okay. But the point is that I was teaching this course and I came upon the work of an American, it was either an economist or economic historian, and he was dealing with how it was that the South developed not unlike what we used to call a third world nation, and the North and the West somehow had broken out of that kind of life in a more industrial and developing kind of way. But anyhow, as I was reading his work, I came across this really great quote, which I stuck on my introductory sociology course. In fact, I had students write about it in response to their reading of Domhoff's book, The Powers That Be. This is back in 1987. Barbara Garson's All the Livelong Day, and a book by Stuart Ewan, Captains of Consciousness. And here was the quote: "Class societies are not a product of nature. Considerable human effort and struggle is necessary to create and maintain a system in which some people do the work from which others derive the benefits." I figured that was a nice, plain, straightforward statement. My wife loved it, by the way. And she actually, where she was working, which was the headquarters office of the largest non-labeled cheese company in America. It's a cheese company that provides the cheese for all the pizzas people eat around the country and the hamburgers with the cheese on top, that kind of stuff. And she stuck this on the front of her desk. And whenever somebody of a more, one of her bosses or one of the senior people come by, they would always read this. And she would always get a kick out of the fact they would read that and they say, yeah, I guess that's true. It's as simple as that. So, I think, to me, one of the things that people said to me, are you still a Marxist? And I'd say, well, in some ways, how could you not be? How could one not be? Okay, even if I don't say I'm a Marxist, whereas once upon a time I sort of bowed to that kind of term and said, yeah, I embraced it. But it is the case. How are we not compelled, okay, as human beings to ask about how it is, okay, that we see around us exploitation, not just inequality, but exploitation. This idea of some people living off the work of others. Although I love it when some people have said to me, well, doesn't Bezos work? Didn't he work to create all this? I mean, and then I actually have to quote them Lincoln to get at the whole point of who creates value. I'd rather than go to Marx. So I think to me, to be a Marxist historian is to start really by asking, so what's going on here? I mean, what kinds of social relationships, as Brenner, I think, put it, of extraction are taking place here? Now that doesn't mean that everything necessarily, as we used to say, gets reduced to that, nor does it mean that's the only thing worth looking at. But it is interesting to know how with that at the core, what kinds of relations of oppression and for that matter, struggles of liberation take place within that context. To what extent is there just an ongoing struggle of I need more money, or I can't give you more money, in your wage package, that kind of stuff? Or does it take on a larger scale of organized workers, or for that matter, in the past, mobilized peasants? Those are the kind of things to me that I would at least start with. And I'll just say one other thing so that it's clear to people who wonder if I've left behind all this stuff in my work on Thomas Paine, or for that matter, Roosevelt and the Greatest Generation. And the answer is absolutely not. Okay, absolutely not. I didn't write them as political economies, But
Mhm.
I wrote them with the idea that this whole question of exploitation was at the heart of the matter, and how people mobilized around it or didn't mobilize around it. So anyhow.
Yeah, I like that. I like that Mill quote very much. I think that is a really nice, vivid.
Yeah, that's actually, I should apologize. That was Frederick Sturton Weaver. That's his
Okay,
name.
Frederick Sturton Weaver. You found it in
Yeah.
there. Okay, yeah. No, that is a very good quote, and I think that is a really good starting point to sort of give people an idea of what we're talking about. You know, that that it seems like like a Marxist theory of history is a theory of how it is that different class societies in which there's a class of people who are working and a class of people who are in some way or another living off of what they've some of the product that's been created by the people who are working, like you just said, how those work, why it is that they come into existence at the time they do, why it is that they go out of existence at the time they do when that happens. And I think that the like so much, like even if you read like Capital, of so much of Marx is devoted to arguing that it's not natural, that this isn't something that should be naturalized or sort of equated with just sort of work or production or having any kind of economy at all, that these are like specific historical arrangements that come into existence in a specific time in human history. So I like that very much. I do want to follow up on the part about reductionism, but first, Adnan, is there anything you wanted to sort of chime in on about what Harvey just said?
Well, just quickly to underscore, I think something that I share with Harvey, that you can't actually, of course, there's a narrow way of identifying, Marxist history, and, that is really asking about, the way in which modes of production have shaped, particular moments and so on, in a sort of narrow sort of way. One
Mhm.
That's how you could define it. But I think you can't really, after Marx, be a serious historian without being, informed and influenced by the legacies of
Mm.
Marx, unless you're doing some very rarefied intellectual history that doesn't assume much context other than a conversation of books, or doing a certain kind of very narrow political history that looks at individual choices and decisions in a kind of, I don't know, like the sort of stuff that comes up on presidential histories and things like that so often. Anything else that you do that's serious is in some ways Marxist history, in the sense that you don't look at forms of culture or social relations as abstracted from one another. Like there's not a real way to explain things without seeing the interconnections between phenomenon, in history, socially, culturally, ideology. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about one of the bedeviling kind of issues of base and superstructure that has been posited and constructed out of Marxist sort of historical theory. But I feel like, Harvey, that if you are doing serious history, you're looking to the interconnections, the power relations embedded within, social and material. And that's what I really think historical materialism is not abstracting these as separate and outside of the rest of the totality of society. Now, you may not be able to talk about everything all the time, but when you take a phenomenon like, say, Eric Hobsbawm did in one of his really great books, Primitive Rebels, studies in archaic forms of social movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, is he's taking a phenomenon that would appear to be a political, a political dissent, looking at peasants' revolts or other kinds of rebellions, but then putting it into a fuller social context, not just in political terms, but seeing politics itself as embedded and talking about them as social movements, archaic social movements. So that's what I think some of the legacies of Marx is, in the broadest sense, is that if you're doing modern history and historical analysis, you're doing something that in some ways is a legacy of Marxist thought and of Marx's own historical understanding.
As you said something about ever since Marx, it's hard not. How could one be a historian? And just have to ask. In fact, I think, and Mills, to go back to Mills, I haven't talked about Mills in a long time, but Mills said, basically, if I've got my memory right, that after Marx, it's just an ongoing debate with Marx's ghost. Okay, and I think he was thinking in particular, say, of Weber, but perhaps Durkheim as well. Now, what I was going to say, though, in response to what you were saying about how could you not be, is that think about the politics of being a Marxist intellectual and the possibility of surviving in the late 19th century and a good part of the 20th century, writing in such a way that is evidently the kind of Marxian history that later the British Marxist historians wrote. You wouldn't have made it. It just wouldn't have happened. So, it took a long time for people to perhaps even come out as Marxist historians. And perhaps before that, they would have had to sound like just economic historians. I do wonder about that quite often, to what extent really some of the great intellectuals who we would admire, both adopt a form of Marxian thought, but at the same time have to frame it in a way that doesn't make it come across as class struggle analysis, for example, or whatever. Anyhow, that has occurred to me over time. I've not.
Yeah. So in the what Adnan said just now, he mentioned base superstructure, which I do want to come back to, and Harvey said a couple of things about kind of the intellectual critiques of Marxist theory of history, where people use words like reductionism and determinism, and I think there are a couple different things that people can mean by that, right? One is about some of the base superstructure stuff that Adnan said. I do want to circle back to that in just a minute, but the other one that's maybe worth, and is also implicit in some of what Adnan said about doing history without doing this, and and what are the sort of areas where you might be able to do that. So one question is just kind of like, what's the subject matter of historical materialism, which is a fancy term for Marxist theory of history, right? In other words, are we, what is the sort of, the explanandum? What is the thing that this is meant to explain? And certainly, if you're like, you might think, well, basically what it's supposed to explain is why you have one mode of production at one time of history and a different one at a different one, right? Why we had, why we have capitalism and we used to have feudalism and we don't have feudalism anymore and all that stuff, right? And then, I guess at the other extreme, just to straw man it a little bit, you could think that every single thing that's ever happened is explainable in purely economic ways. You want to know why, Matt Gaetz, didn't support Kevin McCarthy. You want to know why the plot of the last Marvel movie was the way that it was, that we'll have some sort of explanation for you in terms of forces, relations, and production. But then like in between, I think there's a lot of gray there, because it's, you could, I think, not unreasonably think, well, okay, probably that's too much. Right? Like not everything that ever happens is a result of economic factors, but, we do maybe want to reasonably explain more than just, why you have one mode of production at one time in history and, and et cetera. Because it also seems like, questions like, I don't know, why did the English Civil War happen, or, something like that, right? Like those seem to be exactly the kinds of questions that this sort of analysis should be able to tell you something about. So, either one of you, if you wanted to jump in on that sort of like how wide is the scope of what we're trying to explain when we think about history this way?
Well, for example, I think I never forget, Mike Kaye once said to me, "So are you still a Marxist?" And I said, "Well, I guess. My way of thinking has not changed." So to give you an example, I mean, after all these years of working on more sort of on American stuff, how does one possibly understand the last 45 years and where we are at this moment without seeing the degree to which these last 45 years just really have been marked by a real class war? I mean, I can't conceive of any other way of understanding the stretch, say, from the 70s through even Matt Gaetz and Kevin McCarthy, okay, without seeing it in the context of this just ongoing class war against the democratic achievements of especially working people in the 30s and in the 60s, even if the gender and color combinations change. And so, I mean, it's like embedded, you might say. So, I mean, I could get down to, to the details. For example, I don't think there's anything crude in saying that the Democratic Party, when we say that, they're slaves to the donor class or anything like that. Okay, I don't necessarily. I think that may be a crude way of putting it, a very crude way of putting it. But it is the case that contemporary politics is that commodities and profit questions, all of the things are so embedded that we've literally transformed our public services into capitalist enterprises, okay, cost centers, and so on. I mean, it's just. Sorry, I maybe.
No, I got you, right. So I think, like, one way of thinking about what you just said might just be like, put it really crassly, like, vulgar Marxism, everything is about economics, might not be 100% right, but it's kind of 95% right.
I wouldn't go that far because because one of the things that is striking is the degree to which is that what happens is that people generally then the reductionist thing is when people then reduce particular decisions and behaviors to that. Okay. I mean, and afford no free will, right? I mean, I'm sure you've all been, sorry, I go back to my classroom experience all the time. I'll never forget the first time I was in a full-time position over in Minnesota, and students basically, they, in the 70s, late 70s, they had so reduced their own imaginations that they couldn't conceive of anything that people didn't do to maximize their own benefits. They could not get out of the idea that people were not operating as selfish beings. It's fascinating. So that, I mean, and that wasn't even economic. That was reducing it to a kind of human nature. I mean, it's what they were doing.
Well, that's a great point.
Explain to people that human nature is socially, there may be universals, but there's not always the same way of pursuing it.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to point that out. It reminds me a little bit also of Marx's statement. Maybe it's in Communist Manifesto, of just how men make their own history, right? But they don't make the conditions, right, in which they make that history.
Right.
So that's a balancing between a sense that you are agents, you make decisions. There are moral kinds of questions about how to respond to the exploitation that you experience or feel. Political questions, how to do that, solidarity, etc. So there's a whole range of decisions that people could make, but these are always, of course, constrained by other material conditions and social factors that could be understood very much in terms of economic relations, the conditions in which people have, to survive, and where they have opportunities to find resource. So there is a whole lot of framing conditions in which that history is going to be made. And I think the other real question or real problem for Marxist oriented history is explaining how change happens. So you can understand those conditions and you can describe them sometimes in very structural terms. But the point is that everything does change in various ways. And how do you grasp and understand in what ways it changes? What are the conditions under which more dramatic changes take place? How do new structures get formed? It seems to me this is the kind of big problem or question. And what Harvey was just describing about this kind of class warfare and counter reaction to the gains democratically made in the 30s and 40s, the great, the New Deal, and then, second round perhaps in the Great Society. But starting in the 70s, there is
our friend Pascal Robert called the long counter revolution, the last 50 years.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And by the way, I mean, one of the things that was just, I remember asking myself, well, why? Where does this come from? This compulsion, I'll use that term, the compulsion on the part of capital to all of a sudden declare war on the democratic achievements of a long arc of, say, the age of Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never forget reading about this in the 70s into the 80s at some British Marxist economists. I said, look, there was a profit squeeze. There was a profit squeeze. Japanese and West German industries had revived in the wake of the war. And now American industry, which had had basically a monopoly in the world, in the Western economy for so long, well, at least for so many years, is now all of a sudden having to compete. And moreover, the American corporate enterprise had actually lost the innovation and, well, the talent for innovation. They got caught up in their own success. Okay, big cars, gas guzzling, it was this kind of thing. So all of a sudden you've got this profit squeeze. I'm using automobile industry, which was so significant in the American life at that time. And they had to find out, had to ask themselves, well, how the hell are we going to sustain our profits in this competitive environment we're now in? And of course, the best thing how do you sustain your profits? You either get more out of your workers, right? Or you reduce what you give to your workers. Okay. So in fact, the class war begins. Now, at the very same time, of course, they're under pressure because of that arc of the 30s to the 60s, not only from the liberal government of the 60s, and don't forget, all those folks who are voting on those laws in the 60s were themselves veterans as kids of the New Deal and World War II. They had expectations. They were a decidedly progressive, and in contrast to so many other generations, possibly radical generation. And their kids, my generation, are now demanding a whole host of other things. So you've got these kinds of pressures. So you get leaders of corporate industries and banks giving speeches, writing memos. We're under siege. Capitalism, democracy cannot continue to coexist this way. By the way, they actually wrote that.
Yeah.
And so they declare war. I mean, it was a blatant declaration of war. Of course, liberals didn't want to believe that was fully happening, even though they themselves were starting to participate in it. Okay. And workers themselves, though much more organized then than they are today, okay, their own unions had become more what was called business oriented rather than movement oriented. Okay, they clearly were not prepared for that class war. And of course, we're operating in a global economy. So if they created problems, well, just as companies had moved from New England to the South, they were then going to move to Mexico, Southeast Asia. In other words, so in essence, what I'm talking about is this global dynamic, which is definitely changing the lives at the ground level of American working people. And then, of course, Republicans are brilliant at harnessing all this, Reagan's new right. And I often tell people, you really want to explain what happened in the 70s, why it is that it seemed like working people either didn't show up or showed up to vote for Republicans, because their wages were being literally reduced in terms of the inflation of the day. I mean, seriously speaking, working class Americans have not seen a significant rise in their wages since the early 1970s. We're 50 years later. And so what do? Well, Republicans are arguing as the servants, especially the servants of capital, you might say. They want less government, lower taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So they offer to cut taxes. That'll be the way to stimulate growth. It'll put more money into people's pockets, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you're a worker whose wallet is being emptied of wages, and somebody says to you, we're going to cut taxes, you don't give a shit if the capitalists are going to get millions and you're only going to get hundreds or thousands at very best. You'll take the tax cut. And so you vote, hell yeah, right? And by the way, in 1980, everyone didn't go out and vote for Reagan all of a sudden. Millions of working people just stayed home. They refused to vote because Carter was so abysmal and Reagan offered them really nothing. They could see through the bullshit. But there you go. I mean, have the Democrats ever since done anything other than offer the similar kind of argument? No.
Yeah. So when you think about like the 70s, that the transitional period that you're talking about, certainly, I mean, look, I don't think in the US we ever came anywhere close to even the level of sort of social democratic reforms that have been achieved in many European countries. And certainly nowhere, within many miles of the sort of outermost limits of what capitalism can take. But when you did have more, an expanded welfare state, when you did have more militant labor unions, that contributes along with all the rest of those global factors to that profit squeeze that you're talking about in that response. And, there were places in the world like Sweden, where you had accomplished much more and you really were kind of getting to those sort of limits of what the system can take, which is why by the 70s, the socialist movement in Sweden was actually talking about, like there's the Meidner plan to sort of slowly transfer ownership of major businesses to these funds that would be controlled by workers, which then, predictably led to huge backlash and, they went in the other direction. But thinking about examples like this kind of gets us back to where we were a few minutes ago about, you talk about structures, Adnan, used the word superstructure earlier, right? So very roughly, there's this idea that, like Marx says in 1859, that different societies and, at different times, depending on the sort of level of development of the forces of production, the capacity of a society to make stuff, that in some way or another, and there, certainly subtleties here we could get into, but, downstream of that is what is what form of economic organization you have, that, again, do you have lords and serfs or workers and capitalists or what? And then downstream of that is what Marx calls the superstructure, right? Literally like a structure built on another structure. So and it is part of the theory that I want to think a little bit more about now. So Adnan, you kind of brought that up originally. Do you want to unpack a little bit of like what Marx means by that and what kind of debates people have about it?
Well, yeah, obviously this is a really complicated, issue, and so much ink has been spilt. Thankfully, probably no blood, but you never know. At least a lot of ink has been spilt on, trying to, resolve this question of the relationship between productive forces, that base, and ideological and cultural kinds of phenomenon, which are identified with this superstructure. And, typically, I guess, the first insight that I think is so profound and important in Marx, when you read even his early, pre-Kapital, early Marx, German ideology, and some of these, early works, is that he really grasps something very important, that it's not, and this is of course the turn to materialism, is that it's not that the ideas necessarily transhistorically develop, and then produce history and change people's consciousness and, then affect the material conditions of of society and economy and so on, but rather that in many ways, these ideas, philosophy, religion, other cultural forms, and ideology are patterned or at least responsive in some sense and reflect the social and economic conditions of society in which they are generated, right? And also that the reception, I think he really has a sense of the reception of certain ideas circulating and becoming dominant, is partly because the conditions are appropriate for this to make sense in the world that people are living. And so that suggests, that there is some dependence, that the intellectual, cultural, the ideological is somehow flowing from these underlying conditions. Now, some people have interpreted this as a very close connection, and others have pointed out that, in fact, actually, for the functioning in some ways of a certain mode of production for exploitation, the kinds of themes and issues Harvey was talking about in class struggle, in order for these to maintain some kind of continuity and actually manage a form of production, the ideological actually plays a major role in kind of conditioning the culture, and so that it's not just a one-way movement where culture just follows from these productive forms, but in fact, actually, culture and ideology and ideas have to develop and do develop in various ways and become dominant when they accord with these and align with these kinds of conditions. And so that's why, if we want to come more to the present, and I hope following up on Harvey's point about the kind of what some people would call the neoliberal era, or basically the dismantling of the welfare state and the form of society and economy that developed in the 30s and 40s, is that you can see very easily that there is also a shift and a change in approaches to history. This is the period of the cultural turn. This is the period where anthropology becomes really important. Semiotic and cultural criticism becomes really important for people who are doing what's called the new cultural history. And there's certain turns away from the social history of the British Marxist historians. Although I think, and Harvey can jump in, they're very complex. They're not so, there's still so much to gain from their understanding of culture.
And I do want to jump to Harvey on that in a second, but I do want to just because something you just said is really interesting to me. Like, I don't know if you read the Vivek Chipper's new book, the Class Matrix, it's called, but something he talks about at the beginning of that is that there is this sort of something, there is a certain kind of really strange irony about the timing of this cultural turn that goes along with something Harvey said earlier, that you sort of have all this theory that says that, well, there really isn't such a thing as as a economic structure that we could talk about, separately from the sort of very fine-grained particularities of culture, that's separate from it, or has this sort of causal influence on it in the way that that sort of old line Marxists would think. And all that theory is happening at a very time when this kind of neoliberal counter-revolution is sweeping the world and imposing this very raw version of capitalist economic structures on the world, right? I mean, in other words, it seems like there's events that are actually happening in history are do seem to be showing that that there are, in fact, because all over the world with very different cultures, etc., you're getting the same kind of neoliberal economic push, right?
You're getting the same push, but what's interesting, and this is related, I think, to the cultural turn, if W.E.B. Du Bois was writing, in the later 20th century and about the late 20th and early 21st century, he would say that the problem of this era is the culture line, right? Rather than the color line, right? Where, race predominant in geopolitical, because of the era of colonialism globally. He would say that it was the problem of the culture line, because so much of class analysis and race analysis got moved into cultural analysis and differentiation of cultures. So even though the neoliberal process is globalizing, the way in which it does, and this was, I think, an interesting insight of Hart and Negri in Empire and Multitude, which was that this era of capitalism has transformed itself to actually make use of, in terms of marketing and appealing to, these narrow, specific cultural identities. And this can be everything. It can be, I'm a rebel, and so I'm countercultural and I'm non-corporatist, or it can be, marketing and maximizing, in the way that, for example, Islamic finance. Okay, this is a form of globalizing neoliberal forms of banking and finance. However, it has to be done in certain specific rules to appeal to Muslims, to fit Islamic legal considerations. So it's mortgages and it's interest, but just not by that same name. And it's, more complicated interest. It's interest, but it has to be, run through some other cultural paradigm in order to reach these markets. And this is huge business. So you're right that it's globalizing the neoliberal paradigm, but part of the way it works was exploiting this retreat from any kind of collective, common, or class and, objective materialist analysis to some of these cultural sorts of forms as part of the way in which capitalism was adapting and moving.
Yeah. There's certainly stuff I want to follow up on, but Harvey, do you want to chime in on that?
Well, first I want to go back a little bit, and I don't want to get hung up on it, but I do enjoy your analyses, but I don't see how one can imagine even social relations of extraction, surplus extraction, as something specifically any more or less material than anything else. And what I mean by that is, how could you possibly have capitalist activity without law? And law doesn't just sit outside in the form of a security officer. The law is literally defining and rationalizing sort of what's going on inside the workplace. Okay. Everything, so in other words, the very activity, that's first. Second, second, there was a really interesting set of studies. I won't remember the titles. This goes back probably, let me think, maybe late 80s, early 90s in American history, having to do with the Second Industrial Revolution and beyond. And one of the things that these historians were working on was to what degree the struggles of the workplace were actually defining the kinds of technologies that were being adapted in the workplace as a way therefore of de-skilling workers, removing the power that is in the hands of the workers and their foremen, say, and embedding it in something which didn't even exist until the late 19th century, management. And am I wrong? I don't know Italian, but I remember reading somewhere in a Dickens novel that to manage means actually to break horses or something like that. Have you ever?
I don't know this.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean the first thing you said about the law, right? I mean, so when Marx uses this term superstructure in 1859, the phrase he uses is like a society with given form of class relations throws up a legal and political superstructure. He's talking about what the laws are, what the political institutions are. Which presumably the idea, I mean, the reason that an economic structure needs a legal and political superstructure is to, same reason you might literally build one structure on top of another to stabilize it, to like keep it going, the way that it's going.
Well, in that case, the superstructure is the base.
Well, they have
what you just said.
Yeah. So maybe, right. So the question, so this is like a traditional challenge to Marx's formulation there, which is, like Plekhanov talks about this. I don't think he has a great solution. I think there are other people. I think G.A. Cohen talks about this. I like what he says about it more, but like that is saying, okay, well, hold on. How can it be that there's a base and there's like a superstructure that like results from this base if what the base is a set of economic relations? Well, aren't we ultimately talking about property relations, and is it property a legal concept, right? I mean, I think that's roughly what you're talking about. So like if you read that the Cohen book just mentioned, the Karl Marx's theory of history, that in that's the one.
Boy, I
in
read
there,
that. Boy, it's been a long time since I read that. Wow.
yeah, well, it's a good book. But in there, he's kind of has this idea that, well, what we're really talking about, we talk about economic structure, relations of effective control, which usually line up with what the law says, but not necessarily, not always. That sometimes, like thinking about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, that you had like the guild system. There were rules about like how many apprentices you could have, to a master. The guild, which basically made anything like a factory impossible. And it worked a little bit different in different countries, but in some cases, just as the efficiency advantages of like having factories became obvious, you sort of had mass flouting of the law on the ground before the law was gotten rid of or changed. So, but then like there's another issue, which I think a lot of what Adnan said earlier gets into, which is about not like a legal and political superstructure, but about ideology. That there's, in other words, that Marx also says in that same passage, that 1859 preface, that social being determines social consciousness, which is a very evocative turn of phrase. What exactly it means, is a tricky question. But like there is this idea that like in some way or another, what Adnan said earlier, how ideas are received at any given time in history, is in some way is downstream of economic structures. That the ideas, the ruling ideas, or the ideas of the ruling class, and certainly like I mean, something that makes the kind of cultural analysis that Adnan is talking about, and like you think, okay, well, if a materialist theory of history is as opposed to anything, it's as opposed to an idealist theory of history, a theory of history according to which ideas are the sort of primary things that explain what happened. But it would obviously be silly to say that like nothing ever happens as a result of ideas in people's heads, because I mean, yes, it does, right? I mean, like we could be more serious than that. But it seems like if you're talking about anything that would recognizably be a form of historical materialism, on some level, you think that even if it's not deterministic exactly, that there's like you want to leave room for free will and people being influenced by ideas, because all that stuff clearly happens. But like that on some level, there's some kind of primacy to material factors. So.
Sorry, if I can just.
Yeah, please.
So think about it this way. First of all, the ruling
ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. Yeah.
Right. And that's true, but they're not the only ideas that are out there at any given time. And in fact, the ruling class has to put out a hell of a lot of effort to try to get them to be the ruling ideas and to sustain them. I mean, I'm thinking right now, if you know, I'm working on this piece on Roosevelt, where I'm actually going to argue that he's far more of a radical than we on the left have appreciated. Anyhow, he's born into the Gilded Age, this late 19th century age of the robber barons, and the vast majority of American working people, farming and urban industrial, are living in poverty or next door to it. And clearly the dominant ideology is that of free individualism, free markets, and social Darwinism. Okay. And this is as a way of bolstering this truly abysmal social order. But it's also the case that at the very same time, populism is emerging, farmers' movements, unions, socialism, the anarchists, right? And those, right, in part because of immigration, but very much also homespun stuff by the, Midwestern farming families, who themselves have read the Declaration of Independence. They know this stuff from their schooling. So in many ways, I mean, we would be, and I'm sure the three of us don't have any trouble understanding this, but it is the case that even those kinds of struggles themselves, which are really about everything from exploitation to property, and property relations, so on, they're all at the same time subject to these ongoing struggles. So how does one make the ruling ideas? How does the ruling class make its own ideas the ruling ideas? Well, in part, they hire people to beat the shit out of the people who won't buy into it if worse comes to worse, right? I mean, I know that's a crude way of putting it, but
I mean, look,
that's what you get.
I mean, there is some of that, right? I mean,
you can get the National Guards, you can get the Pinkertons. I mean, it's all part of that. But it's clearly the case that the ruling ideas of the late 19th century were the ideas of the ruling class.
Yeah, I mean, right, and so that's like an extreme idea version, but I mean, like that's certainly one of the mechanisms. I mean, even in like gentler forms than that, and you were talking about like academic thinkers who didn't call themselves Marxists, but seemed to be influenced by a lot of Marxist ideas and so on, right? I mean, it's not like I mean, if you think about the Cold War and the way that played out in academia, I mean, that there is, I mean, like it's not Pinkertons with clubs, but I mean, there is a certain level of just direct exclusion, that went on.
And by the way, in the 70s, to go back to that period, there began a real war on humanities and social sciences. And it wasn't a Red Scare thing, although William Simon, who was the Treasury Secretary under Nixon, actually did go out around the country calling for action against the 10,000 Marxists who had taken over higher education. That didn't work in itself, but basically speaking, this whole propaganda machine got going about the fact that you don't want to get an English degree, a history. You don't want to get degrees that might make you think about humanity and values and all that. You got to get a business degree. I mean, when I was an undergraduate in the late 60s into the early 70s, the best schools in the country wouldn't even offer a business degree. It was considered crass and technical. I mean, why would you want to do that, right? I mean, they might offer economics degrees, okay, but you wouldn't have offered business degrees. I'm not joking when I say that at all. And then all of a sudden, in every way, we're told students are hearing, well, you're not going to get a job if you don't take business degrees. And then if I'm getting carried away, I'm remembering at some point, I remember sitting on an airplane flying back from Boston, having visited my daughter. This young woman gets on and sits next to me. And I assume she was a student from one of the New England universities. And I asked her, and she was in fact a senior at Wesleyan or somewhere else. She's a senior at a university, right? And I said, what do you want to do after you graduate? Grad school? And when the word grad school came up, I could see the look on her face was, what are you, crazy? She said, I want to be a consultant. And I thought, what? I mean, and I actually wanted to say to her, how the fuck do you go out to consult if you haven't done anything? Right?
Yeah. Good.
A whole generation wanted to be, who came out of the better, Ivy League type schools. They want to be consultants.
Yeah. So I did want to take a couple steps back to what we were talking about earlier. We have a question in the chat about the Frankfurt School. Adnan, were you interested in weighing in on that?
It's such a huge topic, and I certainly far from the expert. I'm sure you could probably get half a dozen people in here from your network who know more about the Frankfurt School. I mean, I think it's obviously very interesting as a reinterpretation in the vein and in the tradition of Marxist thought to try and explain new realities, obviously to confront the real conditions of fascism and the fact that, certain kinds of expected revolutionary politics didn't, achieve
Not
success.
to mention the fact that millions of workers went into the fields of, whatever they call it in Europe and killed each other.
That's right. Yeah, in World War
Yeah.
One, and so obviously, I mean, I think it's interesting because I'm unlike a philosopher, and maybe I think I've got backup here in Harvey, so I can kind of say this. We can double team you here, perhaps, Ben. Is that I really do take up that idea that
Yeah.
ideas and theory has its history and its relevance to the time in which it is developed and the
Mhm.
time in which it is received and interpreted and commented upon as an influential kind of mode of thought. And I definitely see it as something emerging from the cataclysms of European history during that time. And think
If I
that
could just throw it, and to sidebar, I have to confess, I mean, in spite of my being a historian, I confessed to a fascination for years, which I think has really helped me understand history all the more for most of the Marxist theorists we would likely mention, but especially in my case, Antonio Gramsci. I found him just utterly insightful, and not just in terms of enabling one to understand history, but maybe to have a better sense as to one's role and possibilities and impossibilities as an intellectual. I mean, and by the way, I rarely call myself an intellectual, but there I did it. Okay.
Fair enough. And I think you're right. I mean, we were talking about, the Frankfurt School, but like you, I would find more of value to me as a historical thinker in Gramsci and these ideas of hegemony and trying in that particular way of trying to resolve the base superstructure, kind of relations. What is ideology? I find Gramsci just really, really compelling.
Yeah.
But I do think that is one of the great contributions of, in different ways of the Frankfurt School, is that they were, you can't have like somebody like a Frederick Jameson who, has a theory of literature and postmodernism that is so sophisticated and rooted in materialist understandings of history without, the work of the Frankfurt School, I think, without Georg Lukács and these sorts of people. So, a lot of times these discussions, are who do we think is right? I never think that you could ever really determine. You might learn something interesting, from somebody who you would disagree with or think they took, their theoretical approach or their historical analysis down the wrong path. You might nonetheless really gain something from them. So when it's like a case of, usually in left circles, what do you think of the Frankfurt School is like a question of, do you agree with them and are you in that camp or are you not? And I don't take a very sectarian approach particularly to theory. And I think maybe that's a privilege for historians, is that we can always say, well, look, we got to look at what happened and analyze that from the evidence. And, if theory emerges or helps us clarify something, great, we'll use it, but we don't have to take a position on the theory on theoretical or philosophical grounds.
Yeah. And I think I've mentioned to both of you, obviously on separate occasions, since it's the first time the three of us are together, that one of the reasons that I actually left the discipline of history officially after my undergraduate degree was my frustration that historians would not talk about theory as a way of better making sense of the world. And so I moved into social science, but I discovered social science was equally empty of the most, at that moment, of what I considered to be the when I finally was introduced to it, the most compelling ideas and arguments, and that was inside the Marxist tradition. And by the way, there are those in the Marxist tradition who I found myself antagonized by. And, but by the way, in case anybody who's an undergraduate is listening, it often pays to read the folks you don't like, because it does show. I mean, Ben makes a living, basically. Sorry. Ben makes a living from argument. And well, we all do in a way, but Ben has become the argument, and it's striking that you've got to sharpen your wits by taking on these other folks who may have gone down the wrong path.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to say about everything you guys have just said, and and I think the sort of Gramsci kind of view about how to think about these sort of problems in classical Marxist thought, like why don't things play out the way that we sometimes think they will, versus the sort of mentioned Vivek Chibber earlier, like that kind of approach. But as you say, Harvey, this is the first time the three of us have been together with a conversation. I really hope it's not the last time, and I hope
I did too. It was great to see you guys and talk with you.
It's a real pleasure. So much fun.
Yeah, let's do this again in like a month or two. I think that'd be a lot. I think that'd
Sure,
be really
absolutely. And seriously, on a very friendly basis, it is always good to see the both of you. And can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sort of somebody, I don't know how it came up. I saw Feldo's name came up over here. I know Davis. What's he doing with the show? I've talked to him a few times, but it changes day to day what he's thinking. Does anyone know?
Oh, David Feldman?
Yeah.
I haven't. I moved recently. I've been fairly busy, and I haven't heard from him in a minute. I'm not quite sure. But
because when I was going to go to New York before the holidays, which ended up being a very short-lived experience because of somebody getting COVID, he and I were planning possibly on getting together, and then he said, "Well, you know what? I've got all this new technology. Maybe I'll do the show for the first time again on that Thursday night." I said, "Well, then we can't see each other. I understand." And then I never heard another word. I haven't heard a word from him in weeks, other than if I send him a good dirty joke, he'll respond.
Fair enough.
You should. I don't know who you're thinking for your, event, and
you're
looking for a comedian. He might be a candidate.
Yeah,
I think he's reviving the show slowly after technological
I hope
exhaustion.
I hope so. I hope it is being revived soon. But meanwhile, thank both of you guys
again. Thank you.
This is fantastic. So that was Harvey J. Kaye and Adnan Husain. I'll be talking to both of them again very soon in the post game, which we're going to be going to in the next 20 minutes or so. Going to be talking to Matt McManus about Curtis Yarvin, who he has been researching about Ben Shapiro and his amazing formula for understanding political legitimacy. Which Jake, do we have that again? I just want people to be able to gaze on it and see it in its full glory. But yeah, there we go. Like all these things, like the L stands for legitimacy, and it's R is regulation. It's I think it's something else, but anyway, we will hear all about that in the post game with Matt. Meanwhile, though, welcome back onto the screen, Jake. And by the way, I should say, I believe Adnan is also joining us for the post game. So I think he'll be back then. I forgot to say that earlier. But first, there are a couple of other things that have been going on in the world, in my world, in media, that I did want to talk about for a few minutes before we end the main show. So one of these happened last Tuesday. So I've been trying to do the Callin show every day when at all possible. It was not possible today, but every day when at all possible at 4 West Coast. Last Tuesday had to do it early in the morning in my time zone because to accommodate Glenn Greenwald calling in from Brazil. Because there had been this interchange between Glenn and our good friend, my past co-author, guest on the show many times, Branko Marcetic, who's a staff writer for Jacobin, because Glenn had made some claims about what he called the Bernie AOC left, and how he thinks that the Bernie AOC left doesn't really sort of criticize or take on in the right way the national security state, and and particularly his interest in foreign policy, Ukraine, etc. And Branko essentially said, "What the hell are you talking about?" Like Jacobin, which is like the leading magazine of anything you could call like a Bernie left, institutionally in America, is constantly talking about the national security state and calling for de-escalation in Ukraine and criticizing U.S. imperialism and criticizing funding for Israel's repression of the Palestinians and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they went back and forth about this on Twitter for a while, with Glenn kind of saying, well, that doesn't Jacobin's too marginal to really count, and sort of sounded at one point like he was talking about the politicians, and said, okay, but you're talking about a movement, what's the point of comparison here, right? If you're going to talk about, especially if you're going to claim, as Glenn seems to want to, that that the sort of MAGA populist right actually is, taking on the national security state and, U.S. war machine in some way, like most of these guys vote for military budgets all the time. What are you talking about? So that was roughly the exchange. When it happened, I was, I kind of live up on a hill right now. And so I was taking my dog on a really long walk, and I just checked my phone every once in a while. I wasn't actually participating, but I was feeling very zen that day. And so I was like, hey, you guys want to come talk it out on my show? I'm not going to pretend to be neutral about this. I definitely have opinions, but, I'm on Team Branko, but, I think I could host a reasonable conversation about this. So I want to play you guys just a couple of clips from this. So again, the guy with the New Zealand accent is Branko. What I sound like. Other guys, Glenn Greenwald. So let's listen to just a few minutes of this.
The idea that Ukraine is the only litmus test for whether someone's anti-war and anti-imperialist, I think is not really. It's a very shallow way to think about foreign policy and politics.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, just quickly on this foreign policy,
please.
I totally agree. I mean, I think Ukraine is the most important issue. Sure, it's an actual war, very dangerous one. The U.S. is directly involved in it in every way except sending battalions of its soldiers. But I think it's the test far and away. I absolutely agree. There are critical foreign policy questions, but come on. I mean, there's no, I reported on the coup in Bolivia from the very beginning. I was one of the very first people to interview Evo Morales when he went to Mexico City. I flew to Mexico City and interviewed him. I was reporting on, and no one's going to tell me that there was any meaningful voices being raised in the squad or by Bernie about any of that. And, Venezuela is the perfect case. I mean, one of the most pathetic and ridiculous policies that the U.S. national security state enacted totally on a bipartisan basis was this preposterous farce about recognizing Juan Guaido as the official president or the legitimate president of Venezuela. And when AOC was asked about it in an interview with Telesur, she refused to give her opinion. And she said, quote, I follow, what was the exact quote? It was, I defer to caucus leadership on how we navigate this. And of course, caucus leadership was right on board with Trump and Mike Pompeo. In fact, Nancy Pelosi was the first to get up and cheer for Juan Guaido when Trump, welcomed him to the Senate as the president of Venezuela. So, I mean, yes, they are better mildly on Palestinian issues, though even there, it amounts to like AOC voting no on Iron Dome and then changing her vote to present and then crying about it out of some obligation to her Jewish constituents. There's just no Chomsky voices among any of these people in any meaningful way. And even when they utter something relatively good, then, it's done in the most cursory, inconsequential way. There's no real movement behind it. There's no real force behind it. And oftentimes it's even worse. I mean, AOC on Israel and the occupation and AOC on Venezuela and Latin America has been, affirmatively bad, and given her, heritage and her, focus that she claimed originally when she was running. I mean, one of the first things that caught my attention of AOC, and one of the reasons I supported her, she went and tweeted something about how what's going on in Israel and Gaza is such a grave human rights abuse that she refuses to let Democrats off the hook any longer in their support for Israel. And all of those kind of statements disappeared soon as she got to Washington. We haven't heard anything like from her like that in forever. So I agree. I don't think Republicans are better on every foreign policy issue. But let me just quickly conclude with this fast story, which is, you guys probably remember last year, there was this outbreak, let's call it, of protests, anti-government protests in Cuba. And of course, every politician and both parties stood up and started saying solidarity with the anti-Castro protesters, and we have to stand on the side of the protesters, bills to give them free internet and give them money. Of course, it was far from organic. And that night I went on to Tucker Carlson's show, and he is the most watched and most influential conservative commentator in the country, bar none. And he brought up, it wasn't even what I was there to talk about, why is it that idiot Republicans are spending their time on the Hill worrying about the internal affairs of Cuba and trying to intervene in Cuba when we have our own problems to deal with? And that's a major part of what I try and do in Republican politics, is to say, Trump ran on a platform of staying out of people's affairs, America first, this non-interventionist policy. So why should we be sanctioning Venezuela when it hurts Americans and our own interests? Why should we be intervening in Cuba? What role is it of ours to overthrow the government of Cuba? And there is now more movement, I think, on the American right than, again, in the mainstream left, where you almost never hear that sort of stuff from anyone except occasionally Ilhan Omar. So, I mean, I'm curious. I just wish there would be more of that.
Well, hold on. I mean, so this is what happens. You've taken a bunch of stuff AOC has said, and again, lots of people on the left have critiques of AOC, and then you say at the end, oh well, aside from Ilhan Omar, I mean, well, why don't we could just as easily fix out Ilhan Omar. I mean, Ilhan Omar condemned U.S. policy in Venezuela. By the way, Sanders did condemn, and was the only one who called a coup in Bolivia. So I'm not sure what you're saying, that he wasn't that he was silent on that. I mean, I'm not going to go through every single squad member now and go through their entire history and see what good stuff and bad stuff they've said. But I mean, we can pick and choose what we want to make any point we want. The point that we were making, that we were actually talking about in the first place, was not even about the squad. It was about the fact that, again, the vote in Ukraine, sure, that's an important indicator of something, but it's not the only foreign policy issue. And I mean, a lot of these same people are pushing for war with China. I wish actually I would hear more pushback on the right, or people with conservative audiences such as yourself, about the disastrous push, and which is bipartisan. Both Trump and.
All right, let's pause there for a minute. So I think this gives you a pretty good flavor of what all this is like. I'm not going to editorialize too much about some of my own takes about this. I will say, well, actually, I will say one conciliatory thing first, which is that if you saw me kind of like wanly smile for a second while I was listening to all that, is because there was a point where you could hear all of Glenn's dogs barking in the background, and that makes me kind of nostalgic. Guy has a zillion dogs, and I can remember being in studio on the Michael Brooks show while he, I was sitting on the couch, waiting for my turn while Michael is interviewing Glenn in Brazil, and I could just remember as the call started, sounded like there were like 100 dogs barking in the background. But look, I think this idea that there's a sort of, I'm a little frustrated by like sort of giving Tucker Carlson credit for not wanting to invade Cuba, which seems like a very generous curve to grade him on, when other figures, left-wing figures, seem to me to be graded on a much less generous curve, and if AOC says, and I think this is a stupid thing for her to say, she's going to defer to caucus leadership. It's like, okay, so it's like, all right, so she's sort of saying, pass, right? Is essentially what she's saying, right? I'm not gonna express an opinion on this one about the Juan Guaido thing, which, yes, it's a bad thing to say, but it's like, no, come on. I mean, Tucker Carlson says like just vile things, 100 times an hour. Like he said, he wants, he doesn't like the feminization of the military because he wants the military to be full. Or no, his guest said this, but he was nodding. It's like, yeah, that's right. He wants guys in the military who dream of sitting on a throne of Chinese skulls. That was a quote.
And we watched his documentary about, right, or I don't even know if he called it a documentary, but about like the threat of the rise of China, right? Like we watched some of that on the show, even where he seems to be pro ratcheting up tensions there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I would say so. Okay, so let's get to the second part. We're gonna play. Actually, if you go to, just make sure you're getting the right one. If you just go to the information there, on we're just yep, right there. Okay, so if you go down to Branko on the push for war with China, and just click on the timestamp there, I think it'll actually just take you to it directly. Oh, nope, that's my fault.
Focus on these issues. I mean, Jacobin, I, and others have written about not only Ukraine stuff and the insane approach to Russia, but also what is happening in pushing the US towards war with China, which is not just hawkish rhetoric. I mean, Congress has been voting for piling in more and more weapons into the country. It's been voting for basically slashing and getting rid of the policy of strategic ambiguity and the one China policy, which is all factoring into Chinese leadership's decision making around do we invade Taiwan now or later, or do we not invade at all? So the left. I don't think the left really needs to be pushed on this, but I think it is important for people to know that the left is actively involved in these fights. I think I agree with what you said about the constituency and conservative circles around more of an anti-war, at least a non-interventionist policy. I think actually the Obama and Trump examples are both actually really important for this, because what they show, and polls bear this out, they've shown this for years, is that the American public, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever, consistently favors a far more measured and restrained foreign policy than the political elite in the country carry out. It largely, the reason why you get this very out of control, I think, national security state and the blob and all that, is because democracy in the United States has been basically eviscerated over decades, with really money rules everything, not just, in both parties. And what you end up getting is that there's no real democratic accountability to what's going on in Congress, and especially with foreign policy, which is never really a top of mind for people anyway, but it allows people in power to basically get away with whatever they want, along with the various undemocratic institutions that exist to allow them to do that. Just one more point. I think we've been talking a lot about how Trump, ran on all this stuff, which, some of which I agreed with, the more anti-war stance, the kind of flirtation with rejecting Reaganism, all of that was good. And then, of course, once he was in office, he governed like a very regular Republican. He wanted to slash social spending. He wanted to throw poor people basically off the government rolls. He wanted to, he nearly went to war with Iran. He was kind of iffy and wishy-washy about actually withdrawing from Afghanistan, so on and so forth. Tried to foment coups, stepped up drone bombing, etc. Now, would we say that because Trump is, the nominal leader of the movement, of the people that voted for him, that what he did in office reflects on the movement behind him, or the people who voted for him, that means that they themselves are tainted? I don't think I would take that position, but I think that's some of what we see when we talk about how, AOC and Bernie are the leaders of the socialist left, and so therefore whatever they do, reflects on the wider movement. I don't agree with that. I think Trump, AOC, Bernie, all these people, they're politicians. They are connected to movements, some more, some less. But at the end of the day, They're just elected officials that, you know, if you're an activist or just an ordinary voter, you are hoping that you can exert enough pressure on them to actually do what you want. I don't think that they're necessarily, you know, the leading lights of, or the be all and end all of the movement. I think that's an important.
Yeah. All right. One last one, actually. So if you look at that that chapter list, there's the at 5420. Ben follows up with Glenn. That one. Let's just listen to that, and that'll be the last one. Anybody who wants to check out the rest of it can check it out on Callin. You just want to go back to, you know, to the Cuba example, and something that Glenn kind of said in passing about, you know, Trump saying that we shouldn't be intervening in, you know, in other people's affairs, because of course Trump did say a fair amount of stuff like that during the election. Even during the election, he was inconsistent, but he did say a fair amount of stuff like that. I mean, I would point out that, you know, not that I would, you know, not that I think the results are comparable, but I mean, you know, George W. Bush, you know, said in 2000 that he wasn't going to do nation building, but if you look at, you know, what he did in office, you know, I mean, he considerably tightened sanctions on Cuba compared to where they were under Obama. In that example, he, you know, I mean, we're talking about the Iron Dome funding, where most of the squad voted against it, with a couple of shameful exceptions. You know, but Trump ostentatiously moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem to you know, kind of take the occupied East Jerusalem off the table for any future peace negotiations between Israel and Palestine. He, you know, one of the consistent, I mean, you know, the partisan valence of this completely switched, but like one of the consistent Republican objections to Obama was that he was too soft on Russia, and Trump did send heavy weaponry to Ukraine in ways that, you know, that. All right, so I think all that's enough to give you a flavor. You know, if, you know, like, you know, again, I think it's also enough to give you some sense of where I come down on this, and some of my frustration, you know, with some of the positions that Glenn has taken on this, especially on the comparative questions. You know, I think you can be, I think you can have your eyes open about how bad Democrats and liberals are, and how disappointing even more left-wing politicians can be sometimes, and still see that Republicans are worse. Like that just seems obviously true to me, that you know, there might be some questions where conjecturally, you know, that if there's like some particular war that, you know, Democrats are more excited about the Republicans, that, you know, that sometimes happens. But like overall, if you look towards the overall sort of postures towards the national security state, towards the military, you know, and certainly towards all those domestic questions. I mean, you know, that you know, Trump ran saying that he wasn't gonna mess with entitlements, and then he tried to kick a bunch of people off of Medicaid, and you know, make it harder to get food stamps, and, you know, appointed hardcore union busters to the National Labor Relations Board. Like, I don't think it takes anything away from saying that liberals are 10,000 miles away from your political positions to say also these other guys are 11 or 12 or 13,000 miles away from my political positions. And if you don't think you're going to notice the extra couple thousand miles, man, you know, I've got some news for you. You're going to notice. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to chime in on that, but I mean, yeah. So give you a chance to do that.
No, I know I'm in lockstep, and I think it's with Tucker, it's just a bit frustrating, because I feel like, you know, kind of what you were saying, that if you're to cherry pick certain quotes from certain people, like, you know, like when Glenn is like, oh, he said this one, like he agreed that, and this was kind of, you know, maybe not even really like the most important issue Tucker talks about, where he's like, why are we commenting on protests in Cuba, right? I feel like at a certain point you could probably find like one or two positions from people that you generally don't like and try to paint them in a certain way. But if you look at the totality of what Tucker says and what he usually argues for, it seems hard to me to argue that he really has this.
And look, I wouldn't have the slightest problem with going on the show to like just say left-wing things. I think that once you start saying, "Oh, actually, Tucker's not so bad," and it's like, well, what's the political standard that Tucker Carlson passes that AOC doesn't, right? Like that's kind of what I want to know. But I think certainly, whatever the sort of complexities of Republican politics are on Russia, and even there, I think that look. Donald Trump was actually super aggressive in terms of these this geopolitical confrontations with Russia when he was president. But I think given how eager some of these people seem to be to escalate tensions with China, it's like, okay, so man, you just want to have World War III with China, instead of no, Russia's the wrong enemy. We got to have, if we're going to go to, if we're going to take the world to the brink, we got to do it with China. I can't get that excited about that flavor of an anti-war message. Let me just put it that way. But one thing I do want to call attention to that you'll notice about that conversation, in fact, I'm sure is disappointing to some people who are watching because people have strong, preferences and antipathies about media figures. People enjoy having people they don't like yelled at, and so I think the fact there's not a lot of yelling in that conversation, that it's just kind of calmly, it's like I just kind of want to give Branko a chance to kind of calmly say, hey, here's why this doesn't make sense to me, man. What do you think? And kind of have some back and forth about that is relevant for the last thing I want to talk about before we go to the post game. I know we're running late, but I think it's worth spending just a minute on, and maybe we can follow up next week, which is a interaction that's been happening over the course of the last several days. So people may have been following that last week there was a lot of drama about the Speaker of the House election, where Kevin McCarthy, who eventually ended up winning the Speaker election, was opposed by was opposed by the sort of a lot of people in the sort of the hardliners within what's called the House Freedom Caucus. It used to be called the Tea Party, and in fact, I would argue that this wing of the Republican Party is still a lot more like the Tea Party than people who take Republican populism seriously would like to admit. In fact, it seems like a lot of what those guys want is more budget cuts. And I think that, and I think, as George Carlin says, they're coming for your Social Security. But a lot of people took the opportunity to sort of revisit a tactical argument that had gone on the left back in January 2021, which was about something called Force the Vote, which was the idea that AOC or the Squad or possibly the House Progressive Caucus, which is a much larger and more politically mixed entity, than the Squad itself. You have a lot of people who are actually pretty moderate in that, should have used the occasion of that Nancy Pelosi Speaker election, January 2021, as a chance to, that they should have withheld their votes in order to extract from her the concession of her holding a floor vote on Medicare for all. That was the idea of Force the Vote. Sometimes some of its advocates said, and we could also throw in other demands, but realistically 99.99999% of the discussion was about having a floor vote on Medicare for all. So for example, Briahna Joy Gray, you wrote an article for Current Affairs where she was advocating, it's called The Case for Forcing a Floor Vote on Medicare for All. And I never bought this. I don't think it's the most important issue ever. I actually think it's a pretty unimportant tactical question, sort of like, should some politicians have tried a parliamentary maneuver 2 years ago? I think it's probably something that's not worth spending too many minutes on the show. But my perspective was always that what people like Briahna, people like Jimmy Dore, who is like sort of the figure who was most associated with this demand, were saying didn't really make sense to me. And I wrote an article for Jacobin where I responded. It was called Jimmy Dore is right about the urgency of Medicare for all, but AOC isn't the problem. And the case I make in there is having a floor vote on Medicare for all under these circumstances is going to be completely pointless at best and actually counterproductive at worst. And what I mean by that is, at the time, right, Democrats had the slimmest of majorities. Now they have the slimmest of minorities, but they had the slimmest of majorities, and about half of them were co-sponsors for Medicare for all. We had just gone through an election where, like, the Democratic primaries for like a year, the main issue in the primaries was Medicare for all. Everybody had taken a position on this. This, like, if you remember any of those primary debates, there was always like an hour of arguing about Medicare for all in each of those primary debates, without exception. And so anybody who wasn't a co-sponsor by January 2021 was making no secret whatsoever of their opposition to Medicare for all. So I was thinking, okay, so you have half of the, and look, I'm sure some of the people who were co-sponsors would have, like, gotten weak at the knees if there was ever a chance that Medicare for all would have become a reality, and that, like, the insurance industry would have taken out their wrath on them if they'd helped make it so, or it looked like they were in danger of helping make it so. But even assuming every single co-sponsor held fast, it would have been a 3-1 defeat with no suspense or drama whatsoever, because in 50% of the Democrats in the House were openly opposed to Medicare for all. 100% of the Republicans were. So, and it was about a 50-50 House. So that's a 75% no votes. And so, again, there's no drama, there's no suspense, there's 0% chance it wouldn't have failed by at least 3-1. So having a floor vote under those circumstances, it seemed to me that the best case scenario, the absolute best case scenario, would be nobody noticed. It was 5 minutes on C-SPAN, and then it just kind of went into the memory hole. The worst case scenario is that this would be a cudgel that people would use for years to further marginalize the cause of Medicare for all. It's like, oh, why are you crazy socialists still talking about this? This thing that, like, that only got a quarter of the votes in the House with a Democratic controlled House. Why don't you move on to insert some god awful centrist, watered down nonsense here? So, I think it would have been, if it could have at least passed the House, that's a symbolic victory. There's some value in the optics of that. But I think the optics of a massive symbolic defeat are actually pretty bad. That's the case that I made there. Briahna Joy Gray, in the Current Affairs article, she said things like, well, people say it wouldn't get any attention, that it would just be 5 minutes on C-SPAN, but what if it were combined with the general strike? And I said, maybe it's a little unkind in the Jacobin article. It's a little bit like saying, what if it were combined with an intergalactic spaceship landing on the ceiling of, on the roof of Congress, and the aliens demanding Medicare for all? I mean, you might as well say that. We haven't even had a citywide general strike in the United States since the 1930s. And we have like a 6.7% private sector unionization rate. The idea that, between December, which was just when she was saying this, in January, you could get together a national general strike, doesn't strike me as very in touch with reality. And this idea that people had that it would have flushed out the soft co-sponsors, that people who said they were for Medicare for all would have voted against it, then you could primary them. It also doesn't strike me as in touch with reality, because if it's going to fail 3-1, if you're willing to do a meaningless symbolic co-sponsorship, why not do a meaningless symbolic vote for it when everybody knows there's no chance of it passing? In fact, if anything, it might have provided extra cover to Democrats who wanted the stolen valor of supporting it when it didn't matter. There were no consequences. So that was all my view. And look, you can think I'm right about that. You can think I'm wrong about that. That doesn't, I think it's a relatively unimportant issue, because we're talking about a proposed parliamentary tactic that some backseat drivers said some politicians should have tried 2 years ago. I'm not going to be offended if you disagree with me about that. But all of this came up again this last week because these House Freedom Caucus hardliners were getting all of these concessions from McCarthy by withholding their votes from him. And so people like Briahna Joy Gray, Jimmy Dore were saying, aha, see, we were right? Force the vote, it works. which didn't really make a lot of sense to me on a couple levels, mostly because the House Freedom Caucus people weren't asking for any symbolic floor votes on things that had no chance of passing. What they were asking for was stuff like rules changes and committee assignments. And in fact, if you go back and look at what happened during that force the vote debate, people who said, "Oh, well, even if they don't ask for Medicare for all floor vote, it's okay if they ask for things like committee assignments." That's a good enough strategy. We're mocked mercilessly for saying that, because what really mattered was a floor vote on Medicare for all. So we just have a quick clip here that this is Jimmy Dore and Matt Stoller during a discussion about force the vote.
Positively about your campaign, because I like that you're saying they need to ask for things. And one of the things, AOC responded to me and said, actually, we have asked for things, and I'm not being public with what we're asking for. But
it's a secret. It's a secret what they're asking for. It's a big secret.
But it's not. I mean, I know some of the. I mean, AOC is not the lead negotiator. That would be Pramila Jayapal. And like they are asking for things. But I think, and they're getting things. They're getting some representation on committees. It's insider.
Fuck off. Fuck you. Fuck off. Go fuck yourself with your fucking committee, fuckface. You fucking egghead nerd. I don't give a fuck about your committee shit. Nobody voted for her for a fucking committee. Why don't you stop saying that stupid shit?
No.
That's directed at Matt, not at Jayapal.
Fucking Matt.
I have a point here.
Yeah, you fucking bet you do. It's called a Poindexter. That's a fucking stupid thing to say.
Yeah, so all of that makes me think that the force the vote push really was about the symbolic floor vote and not about stuff like committee assignments. I'd also point out, in fact, a lot of the demands that the House Freedom Caucus people made, weren't public, etc. A lot of the negotiations there was behind the scenes. But in any case, so it didn't make any sense to me, but nevertheless, people like Jimmy and Briahna were bringing this back up this last week to say, see, we were right. And as part of that, Briahna had tweeted out an article that Jacobin had just published about the McCarthy fight, saying, there are things you can learn from the way that the House Freedom Caucus people got what they wanted that the left can use. And Brie says, this is much better than Burgess's Don't Force the Vote piece from 2 years ago, but it's odd to write a whole article like this and not once mention that there was a campaign to have the squad fight for this 2 years ago that the magazine never reported favorably on. And then Jimmy himself got in on this. He responded, you still thinking any of these people are acting in good faith is a mistake? Do you really think these eggheads are dumber than a pothead comedian? Nope, they're just bad liars. They have to bend themselves into moronic anti-logic pretzels on purpose to oppose force the vote. So in responding to this, I'd quote tweeted Jimmy's tweet, which was much harsher than Briahna's, as the moronic pretzels and eggheads that were liars and all this stuff. And I had, I said that, let's see if we can find the I think, yeah, anyway, whatever. We might not have the right one, but in any case, I said, I quote tweeted Jimmy and said, hey, I don't know why we're talking about an article that I wrote 2 years ago, about a sort of tactical issue about whether the squad should have tried this particular parliamentary maneuver in January 2021. But since you are, if you're going to say I'm a moronic lying egghead, hey, why don't you come on my show and you could explain why you feel this way, and we could actually talk this out, talk about the details of this, whether this critique makes sense or not. And then I said, obviously, same invite goes out to Briahna Joy Gray. She's been ignoring similar invites since late 2020, even as she periodically expresses anger about my old article. But what the hell? Might as well extend it one more time. There's a bunch more back and forth. Ultimately, she declined the invitation. She said, The record speaks for itself. Your article didn't warrant a response, and you should be thankful I showed grace in the face of patronizing quips over the years. I'll do you the favor of going back to ignoring you. There's nothing to debate. You're wrong. And then Jimmy himself. So that's my response to him. But anyway, I guess you can see the original. Yeah, there we go. So Jimmy eventually responded to me. This is today. Says you were 100% wrong about force the vote. They've been raging over it. So, got all of the angry Jimmy fans to yell at me on Twitter, which proves that he's right. Yet in a desperate attempt to save face, you're pretending there's a debate about it. There is no debate. You're an unprincipled liar who let his jealousy / hatred for a pothead comedian get the best of him. And, look, there's a lot to, say about this. This was my response at the time, that you're just pretending to disagree with me because you're jealous is a hell of a thing for a grown man to say. But I want to take a step back. And, we're running very late. I want to go to the post game in just a minute. But I do want to just take a step back from the kind of details of this, because this is the kind of thing I don't engage with very often at all. Right? I think if you go back and look at the archives of GTAA, there's one clip that has Jimmy Dore's name in it, in the 2.5 years that we've been doing the show. Trust me, it's not because he doesn't say stupid shit all the time that we could talk about if we wanted to, but I'm just not interested in feeding into that. I'm talking about it now because he and Briahna brought it up and used their large and prominent platforms to drag me in this show through the mud, and I do want to correct the record about it. That's one reason. But I think there's also another thing. It's look, I don't think that media figures, going after media figures, it's one thing if it's Tim Pool or Charlie Kirk or somebody, reactionaries whose bad arguments we can kind of use as teachable moments to say things that are important, could do debates with these people and sort of bring sort of basic leftist and socialist ideas to their audiences. I'm all for that. But when it's left or left adjacent media figures, just kind of getting mad at each other, I'm not super interested in doing very much of that at all. But every once in a while, I think it is worth breaking my fast on that and doing just a little bit, because there is a kind of teachable moment here too, which is this is a really bad way to do radical politics. I mean, to the extent that there even is radical politics, because ultimately you're mad that some social democratic politicians didn't try a particular parliamentary maneuver that you thought they should have tried. That's a very inside baseball debate that's sort of within the realm of social democratic electoralism, which, hey, I'm all for social democratic electoralism. I think you got to, crawl before you can walk and change society in more radical ways. But let's also not, ignore the fact that's ultimately what we're talking about here. But this kind of sort of performatively getting really angry at, left-wing politicians who, may sometimes legitimately do disappointing things, who may, as Branko said in the debate with Glenn, have to be constantly pressured to do some of the things that, that we want them to do. Change is accomplished by movements, not individuals. And we certainly need better structures of accountability for politicians. And there's a lot of discussions that adults can have about this, but I don't think this is one of them. I think that this is just a model of sort of doing this all the time. I think, it's good to kind of gaze into the abyss of it every once in a while, just as a reminder of why we try to do things differently here. And before we go to the post game, if Jake, if there's anything else you want to throw in, I will give you a chance to do that. But otherwise, I want to kind of give the last word here, and we'll play this clip, and then that'll be that for the main show tonight, to the late Michael Brooks, who's had a 4 years ago and change, back in 2018. He had a run-in with Jimmy about lesser evil voting and issues related to that. And the reason I want to play this is not like, oh, obviously we love Michael around here, but it's not like, oh, he said it, so you have to agree with him or anything. You should think about his analysis and decide whether or not you agree. It's because I think he's saying something really important, and he's saying it much better than I could. So I want to give him the last word in this episode. Let's play the Michael clip and then go to the post game for GTAA patrons.
Dude, if you want to do politics, you got to fucking understand the issues. It's not all just emotions and fantasy life. Or if you want to do emotions and fantasy life, then own it and just do critique, and that's great. But don't call people who actually care about the process and bother to do some fucking research dummies because they look at things a little bit structurally. It's an easy hustle. It's an easy market. It's an easy game. But it's not contributing to anything. It's not going to help us win.